Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. I'd like to just start by welcoming everyone to Scales Multiple, which is the 5th session in the Animal Scales seminar series. I'm Marianne Motamedi-Fraser, and I'm the convener of the series, which is hosted by UCL Anthropocene. And UCL Anthropocene have been hugely supportive of this series, so I'd like to thank all the people involved, and especially Emma Hart, who put so much work into it behind the scenes. I'd also like to thank Kadambari Rai, who's here today to help me with the technology, and Sonia Turcott, who's going to help me manage the questions during the discussion, especially given we have quite high numbers. Just to say, you've probably already seen on your screen, but just to say that the session is recorded. So just a couple of practical things before I introduce the speakers. The final seminar in this series, Scales Political, is now set for the 11th of December. And the speakers are Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, with Alistair Cochrane and Eva Meyer responding. And thanks to Emma, who I just mentioned, you can find all the details for that on the UCL Anthropocene website. So today, Katie and Dinesh are going to speak for just over an hour together. I mean, separately, but in total. And that will leave the rest of the time for discussions and questions. And so with regards to questions, I'll be identifying people who'd like to ask questions verbally. So please just use the raised hand button. And Sonia will be monitoring the chat and interjecting with questions that have been submitted textually. So feel free to add questions to the chat as we go along. Okay, so it's a great privilege to introduce Dinesh Wadiwel and Katie Gillespie, both of whom, in my view, are giants in the field of animal studies broadly, and whose outstanding research has contributed so much to our understanding of food farming specifically, and especially the lives of the animals who are enrolled into them. In all its dimensions, this is immensely difficult work. And part of the difficulty lies in the sheer scale of food farming systems and the magnitude of the stakes involved. For humans, those stakes minimally, are economic, political, environmental, emotional, and moral. For animals, one might say that everything is at stake. So profound is the problem of food farming. There's a risk of it spinning right off the scales, off all scales. And that, in my view, is dangerous. It's the immensity of it all, and particularly the immensity of the violence, that somehow accounts for the cognitive dissonance that we hear so much about when it comes to eating animals. It's the heterogeneous mass and strength of the forces behind the industry that can make any political objection or contribution feel futile in comparison. It's the organizational complexity of the system, the way it cuts through and across nearly every sphere and scale of social life, that makes empirical or conceptual clarity feel surely out of reach. None of this phases Katie or Dinesh, even for a moment. And for this, I'm immensely grateful. It means they can help us to begin to make sense of it all and to think about how we might get out of it. I'm assuming that most people here know their work or have read their biographies. So the only thing I want to add is that it's genuinely special to have Katie and Dinesh in the same room at the same time. And they've both been incredibly generous in making this possible. It's very early in the morning for Katie. In fact, I'm not even sure we can actually call it morning. And it's going to be very late at night for Dinesh when we finish, and he's teaching tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. So I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to you both from us all for agreeing to do this. So Dinesh, I'm going to pass over to you so as not to waste any further time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marianne. I hope everyone can hear. I just want to acknowledge I'm coming from central Sydney. It's the land of the Wongal people here where I am, and I want to pay respects to the traditional owners of this land. I want to extend thanks to Mariam for this invitation. It's been actually a long time coming, and we're talking about how it was over a year ago that we initially talked about this series and my participation. I really want to thank Katie. And something I was just saying was that Mariam asked me if I wanted a respondent to this particular paper. And first on the list was Katie. And I think I might have said, I don't know whether it's going to work time zone wise. I don't know if Katie will be available, but I was just so over the moon that Katie accepted the invitation. Katie and I have been in the room together once, maybe. I think we met once in Sydney, and it's just it's an honor to be in the same space again. Okay, let me share my slides. Give me a sec. I hope everyone can see that. Okay. Karl Marx begins Capital Volume 1 with the following words. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation, therefore, begins with the analysis of the commodity, end quote. For Marx, this is an invitation to begin his epic theoretical exploration of capitalism through the commodity as a concept and reality, before unveiling the unique theory of value that would underpin his understanding of labour and its distinct alienation and exploitation in our economic system. Here, Marx wrestles with a world that appears on the surface to us as a mass of glittering commodities. His goal is to try and cut beneath this surface to understand the structures that inform this form of appearance. These words that began Capital Volume 1 reverberated for me as I was doing the research for my book, Animals and Capital. So I'll show you that in a second. Animals in food systems today appear as a vast multiplicity of lives, numbingly enumerated in official data sets, but almost impossible to conceptualize due to the sheer scale of their human utilization. The UN Food and Agriculture Statistics inform us that in 2022, there was a standing stock of some 34 billion land animals within food systems. However, this figure hides the sheer volume of animal life that is born, raised, and killed each year in a persistent cycle of life, death, and life again. Perhaps more than 85 billion land animals were slaughtered in 2022, most of them chickens. Data remains unclear on fishes killed for food consumption, though estimates range up to 2.2 trillion wild fishes caught annually and up to 171 billion fishes slaughtered in fish farms. We know that these astonishing numbers, We know that these astonishing numbers of animals utilized within food systems have grown significantly through the 20th century. And it would be easy to conclude that this expansion in the use of animals has simply followed human population growth in an even manner. However, the growth rate of animals as food has exceeded the human population growth rate. In 1961, global per capita meat consumption, excluding fishes and seafood, was 23 kilograms per person per year. In 2014, this has doubled to nearly 43 kilograms per person. World per capita fish consumption has more than doubled, and per capita dairy consumption has grown and is predicted to grow significantly in the global south. While there are, of course, important differences between different regions, localities, and cultures in animal-based food consumption, taking a global picture, all indications suggest that animal-based foods will continue to consolidate their role as a mainstay food staple and continue to grow. In this talk, I want to try and make sense of this scale of mass violence directed at animal life. In this context, I'll share some of the perspectives I develop in my book, Animals and Capital. Much of the book is a theoretical engagement with Karl Marx, aimed at understanding the way that the labour value theory he develops might be applied to thinking about non-human animals. My interest in the book is to understand the structural position of animals within capitalism as a distinct labouring class, highlighting the way that both animals and humans are dominated by capital, but also importantly, demonstrating the unique positionality of animals, one that is necessarily differentiated from humans. The book also seeks to understand if and how alliances between animal advocates and anti-capitalist movements might be possible, and whether a shared vision for post-anthropocentric, post-capitalist societies might be possible. The focus of my talk today will be thinking about the unique way in which the mass-scale reproduction of animal life has become both functional to the reproduction of human populations and also the production of surplus within our economic system. We know, of course, that in order to bring into being the billions of animals who are contained in food systems, or birth the trillions of life forms that will be captured in our waterways, reproduction is required. That is, animals are required to engage in a metabolic labor to produce this life, or more narrowly, what might be described as gestational labor. This is one sense in which I would like to think about reproduction in the context of capitalist animal agriculture today, namely the reality that gestational labor is required by animals in food systems to birth new animals who will, through their metabolic work, become raw materials and commodities within capitalist production. Secondly, I will consider reproduction as the process by which labor under capitalism reproduces itself. That is the process by which bodies recover, nourish, and rebuild themselves between and during phases of the labor process, thus making themselves available for a future expenditure of labor. Finally, I will discuss reproduction and social reproduction, namely the totality of labor processes outside of formal production under capitalism, including unpaid care work, which makes possible production under capitalism. As I shall outline, each of these different processes means something different for the animals that are subsumed within industrial animal agriculture under capitalism. And here, this approach allows us to recognize the different value functions for animals beyond their appearance as a vast assembly of commodities. I will end my talk by reflecting on Sophie Lewis's provocative book, Full Surrogacy Now. As I shall discuss, while I share Lewis's vision for a collectivization of gestational and care labor, I think that gestational labor for animals poses a number of distinct challenges for this vision. However, as I shall argue, reproduction is central to capitalist animal agriculture, and those who advocate for the rights of animals would arguably benefit from understanding the distinct and indispensable role of reproduction as a site of tactical intervention. This is Sophie Lewis's book that I'll be talking about. Part 1, Animals in Capitalist Food Systems, 3 forms. In my view, animals involved in food production take at least 3 forms under capitalism. Firstly, under industrial capitalism, most animals are destined to become consumption commodities. They'll be made dead to become the food that humans eat. This is the commodity form we are perhaps most familiar with because these commodities visibly proliferate in human worlds, predominantly in human food supplies, and as I shall discuss, have been structurally positioned as a means of subsistence for the reproduction of human life. Secondly, animals are the raw materials that circulate within economies. They are worked upon within production lines in order to be transformed into products. Animals arrive within production processes as raw materials that are transformed into consumption commodities. This process of transformation is typically, but not always, out of sight for those who purchase the end product. This transformation occurs, to quote Marx, in the, quote, hidden abode of production, end quote. These 2 different lives of animals within the value circuit of capitalism, alive as raw material, dead as meat, represent different use values. The raw material is useful as a means of generating surplus for capitalist economies. The consumption commodity is alternatively positioned as useful for reproducing life as a means of subsistence. Finally, in the 3rd form, animals labor when their placement within production necessitates that they reproduce value. While animals have traditionally not been seen as laborers, there is of course an emerging scholarship in animal studies and posthumanism, which has positioned animals as workers within systems of value. There are a range of different ways animals have been conceptualized within this scholarship as workers. My argument is that in the case of food production, animals within food systems work on themselves through a metabolic labor to become a consumption commodity. As I shall discuss, some animals perform gestational labor in order to produce new animals or to produce animal-based food products such as milk or eggs. The result of this gestational labor will be new raw materials within the productive cycles of capitalism. I argue, in a Marxist sense, that all this animal labour is positioned as value producing in a way that motivates production and helps to explain the rise of capitalist animal agriculture. These three distinct positions within production, raw material, consumption commodity, and labour, are necessarily entangled. Some animals indeed exist in a hybrid form, embodying all three of these positions almost at once. Thus, the animal used for food, such as a chicken, arrives at the scene of production as a raw material, is required to work on themselves through a metabolic labour, to grow or to fatten, and their lives are extinguished at the exact time that proves most profitable so that they can become a consumption commodity for humans to eat. Of course, not all food animals will become products themselves, at least not directly. Dairy cows appear within production as labour, designed to both produce milk, but as a necessity of this production, will also perform gestational labour to birth new animals through forced insemination, which triggers the processes of lactation. When dairy cows have completed their working life, their spent bodies will become raw materials, eventually becoming consumption commodities. It is precisely the fact that animals are situated at the meeting point of these distinct forms under capitalism, i.e. raw material, labour, and consumption commodity, that suggests that these beings occupy a unique place within systems of exchange, very different from many conceivable forms of human labour. Whichever point in production animals occupy, consumption commodity, raw material, or labour, it is these three intertwined lives that mark out the distinct structural relation of food animals to capitalism, and suggest to me, as I theorise in the book, that these animals have emerged within capitalism as a distinct economic class. And at least insofar as capitalism is defined as an infinite process of overproduction in a quest to maximally extract and accumulate value from labour, then this situation differs from the use of animals in other economic systems, where animals may have been used in production simply to attain a means of subsistence for humans. To an extent, what happens to animals under capitalism is the same story as what has happened to any number of other products: automobiles, televisions, mobile phones, bottled water. They were multiplied, and this case of overproduction had a goal of producing excess profit. Except one difference between these other products, mobile phones or televisions, and the outputs of animal agriculture is that in multiplying animal-based food products, there is also a multiplication of the labour force for the production of these goods, namely animal lives. Another reason why animals, in my view, represent a distinct class. Here, the reality that animals have been proliferated as a means of value production and as consumption items highlights the centrality of the politics of reproduction to these processes. As I have said, this reproduction occurs in a number of distinct and different senses. In one sense, reproduction is central to the composition of the standing population of the billions of animals who are constituents, or the labour force, of the global food system. Today, the billions of animals that exist within agriculture and aquaculture systems can only exist through controls over reproduction, typically achieved through regimes of forced insemination and absolute command over gestational labour. Domestication, of course, implies control over reproduction, and under conditions of intensified industrial animal agriculture, the biopolitics of this reproduction process must be ruthlessly managed to ensure financial sustainability. Here, in order for the raw materials of animal food supplies to become available, a section of the animal workforce must perform forced gestational labour. The biological cycle of animal life must be mapped onto the economic cycle of the production process. For example, of the 75 million pigs in the United States, a veritable army of 6.4 million sows are continuously farrowed in order to produce litters of pigs who will be weaned, extracted, and moved to different processes to become the raw materials of food production. This is the key to the overproduction of animal bodies within food supplies, which in turn enables the production of surplus money in capitalist economies. As feminist animal studies scholars have suggested, it's difficult to separate the politics of industrial control over animal reproduction from the human politics of gender, insofar as those animals with a reproductive capacity are exploited in ways that appear to mirror the contours of power within human gender relations. As Katie Gillespie describes in relation to a dairy cow, her value is explicitly tied to her function as a reproductive machine. A dollar value is placed not only on her body as a reproductive unit, but also on each individual pregnancy. This industry discourse is also more generally a reflection of the way in which the female body is animal body is viewed. That because biologically she can reproduce, staying pregnant must be an inherent function and purpose of her life, end quote. In other arenas of animal agriculture, non-human postnatal processes of care and nutrition are subsumed for human food production. This is, of course, central to dairy industries, which typically use routinized forced industrial scale artificial insemination to induce reproductive processes with the aim of controlling and directing lactation towards the production of milk for human consumption. Death will form the horizon of these practices, since the most common reason dairy cows will be culled is when they are no longer able to reproduce. Thus, from the standpoint of capitalist value production, initiation of reproductive processes enables surplus value. Failure of reproduction means swiftly and economically discarding the labourer through death. Control over reproduction is also central to the emergence of aquaculture or fish farms globally, and this is an image of a hatchery. Industrial scale aquaculture now accounts for more than half of the seafood that humans eat on the planet. Hatcheries are an important part of the value chain, providing juvenile animals to aquaculture systems. In some hatchery systems, a so-called natural process of reproduction is managed within ponds and enclosed enclosures to enable the creation of eggs, which will be extracted from the system. In other regimes, fish are, quote, strip spawned, a process of egg extraction that may involve the injection of, quote, an ovulation-inducing hormone, manually expressing the eggs at ovulation and fertilizing the eggs with sperm, end quote. For some species, such as salmon, strip spawning is lethal, and thus fish do not survive this process of forced reproduction. I highlight this global scale industrial control over the reproduction of animal life to point to both its centrality to contemporary food systems, but also the unique social or perhaps kinship relationship it generates. In a quite direct sense, almost all domesticated animals exist within relations of domination, where surrogacy is a mainstay structuring reality. Almost all animals, as a condition of production, will experience an irrevocable rupture from their birth parent. In this space of industrial scale artificial insemination, routine mass forced separation of young animals from the animals which perform the gestational labour to produce them will be standard. Part 2, animals as a means for human labour reproduction. This process of accelerated expansion of the valorization of animals as consumption commodities reflects the interaction between capitalism and the industrialization of human food supplies. Here we cannot disconnect the relationship between the expansion of animal-based foods and the pivotal role of food for the sustenance of the human workforce for capitalism. For example, Raj Patel and Jason Moore have reminded us that the industrialization of the production of chickens for human food supplies was a central achievement of capitalism in the 20th century. For Patel and Moore, selective breeding and industrialization of chicken production reduced effective food prices, thus keeping the human wage cost down of the economic system. Here, the reproductive labour of animals is captured through industrialization in order to allow for the reproduction of human labour. But this process has two guises. First, in a classic sense, animal-based foods arrive as a means of subsistence for human waged work in formal sites of production, such as the factory or the office. Here, the labour of animals becomes essential to the ability of capitalist production to reproduce its own labour force. At least insofar as production employs human labour that requires a means of subsistence to reproduce it. But animal-based foods are not merely the means of subsistence for humans engaged in waged work. In addition, animals are positioned as a means of subsistence for almost all humans, and thus support and maintain human life engaged in other activities and labour outside of formal production, such as, for example, care work. In my view, this has implications for how we understand what is being called social reproduction theory more generally. Social reproduction theory attempts to not just understand what happens for workers in the scene of production, but also, as Tithi Bhattacharya describes, it is, quote, the complex network of social processes and human relations that produces the conditions of existence for that entity, end quote. This means paying attention to energy and labor outside the formal spheres of production, including care labor regimes and forms of facilitation that enable formal production to occur. Because animal-based foods have been positioned as the means by which the labor of social reproduction can occur, then this subsistence thus becomes, in a weird sense, the means for the reproduction of reproduction. Kelly Oliver reminds us that we have a fundamental indebtedness to animals. To an extent, this idea that animals enable the reproduction of reproduction helps us to make sense of this indebtedness. Animals have been created as a class to be indispensable to the metabolism of human life within capitalism, in a context in which this human life, whether it is involved in formal or informal production, i.e. working in an office or doing care work, is increasingly determined to enhance the productivity of capital. We've seen an increasing tendency emerging in both feminist theorization and green theory to question the line between formal and informal production, arguing that the distinction between social reproduction and formal production is immaterial. Indeed, some have argued that insofar as all human life is subsumed within capitalist production, then all social activities tied up within the value production of capitalism. As Antonio Negri has suggested, quote, society appears to us as capital society. It is through this passage that all social conditions are subsumed by capitalism, that is, they become part of its organic composition, end quote. Well, I think this move makes sense to abandon the old Marxist distinction between formal productive labor and non-productive labor, such as care work. I also want to trouble this distinction in a number of ways. Firstly, as I shall argue, although we may want to place the metabolic labor of animals within the sphere of nature, of a nature that is extracted, I will instead argue that they actually labor within food production in a formal classical Marxist sense. Secondly, it is useful to note that when we examine the world of animals as laborers, we find an absolute collapse of any distinction between productive and unproductive labor. This is because the whole of the lives of animals have been subsumed by capitalism. There is no distinction between public and private spheres of labor for food animals, and thus there's arguably no clear social reproduction for animals. Indeed, a condition for the profitability of animal agriculture is the increasing incorporation of the whole of the life of the animal within the production process. So birth, life, nutrition, sexuality, sociality, sleep, and reproduction means and death are all precisely coordinated and timed to enable profitability. In this sense, social reproduction means something different to animals themselves. Indeed, perhaps industrial animal agriculture reveals the fact that the full social life of animals have been subsumed within capitalist production, so that all time is capitalist time, realizing in a different way Negri's understanding of capital as capital society as our society. Part 3, gestational labour and full surrogacy. With these notes in place on animals and reproduction, I want to steer now to think on the gestational labour of animals within industrial animal agriculture and the promise of this space as a focus for animal advocacy. I note that the reproductive or gestational work of animals such as dairy cows have some resonance with existing forms of human labour, where metabolic processes are drawn on to produce a product which can be alienated from the body of the producer, allowing for repeated production cycles to be completed within that same body. Here we can draw on work within feminist labour studies, which has situated the body itself as a means of production, particularly in relation to commercial surrogacy and other body work. Critical interrogation of commercial surrogacy from a labour perspective is particularly relevant, since this provides one example of a human labour process where the body is utilised as a means of production to enable a particular product to be realised and alienated from the body of the producer, at least from the standpoint of the production process. Amrita Panda's analysis of commercial surrogacy in India is of particular relevance to my analysis here. Panda observes that commercial surrogacy occupies a unique position as a form of embodied labour. Panda says, and I quote, "Surrogacy is an extreme example of the manifestation of worker embodiment, where the body is the ultimate site of labour. where the resources, the skills, and the ultimate product are derived primarily from the body of the laborer. The worker's embodiment is essentially living in the commodity produced, literally in the form of the worker's bodily fluids, her blood, and sweat, end quote. Panda suggests that surrogacy provides a different way in which to understand embodied labor, defined as, quote, a rental of the use of one's body by somebody else, in which the body of the work is the fundamental and ultimate site, resource, requirement, and arguably product, end quote. While perhaps all labor necessitates, quote, a rent of the body, or the purchase of labor power for a market-determined price, perhaps what marks commercial surrogacy is the unique way in which the body's metabolism is subsumed by capitalism, so that the product of this metabolism, one intimately connected with the body of the laborer, becomes the product. And in the case of human commercial surrogacy, this is, of course, the baby. As Panda stresses, for the work of commercial surrogacy, this aligns production with the gendered politics of reproduction. Panda says, and I quote, commercial surrogacy becomes a powerful challenge to the age-old dichotomy constructed between production and reproduction. Women's reproductive capacities are valued and monetized outside of the so-called private sphere. As surrogates, women use their bodies, wombs, and sometimes breasts as instruments of labor. But just as commercial surrogacy subverts these gendered dichotomies, it simultaneously reifies them. When reproducing bodies of women become the only source, requirement, and product of the labor market, and fertility becomes the only asset women can use to earn wages, women essentially get reduced to their reproductive capacity, ultimately reifying their historically constructed role in the gendered division of labor, end quote. The subsumption of gestational labor into the rhythm of capitalism thus offers a bittersweet opportunity to name and value labor that has previously been privatized. But this comes, at least for Panda, at the cost of its inscription within a normative gender system. Sophie Lewis provides, in the text Full Surrogacy Now, a different perspective. For Lewis, commercial surrogacy is undoubtedly a sign of the continuing expansion of the logic of capital and produces exploitation. But for Lewis, it also presents an opportunity to situate all gestational labor, and not just commercial surrogacy, as work. Here, Lewis also provides a useful intervention in challenging normative assumptions on who does this gestational work. Lewis points out that gestating work is performed by bodies who do not necessarily identify as women, and thus Lewis delinks gestational labor from the woman as the normative category. Lewis simultaneously challenges a view that there's something natural about gestational labor, or that we should accept as given that bodies should be consigned to this labor. In this reading, there's little that is pleasurable about gestational labor, nor should this work be accepted because it's purported to be, quote, natural. It is instead work that is often forced upon those who do this labor by norms, work arrangements, or law. This labor connects to a system of property which valorizes the biological connection between parent and child, and treats as natural and inescapable the connection between the child and the gestational labor of the parent. For Lewis, commercial surrogacy thus creates the opportunity to challenge and re-understand reproductive work under capitalism, pulling apart the normative family as it has been constructed. For Lewis, this allows us to reinterpret social reproduction theory through the lens of surrogacy. Lewis states, and I quote, narrating capital's evolving history then becomes a matter of revealing a web of surrogacy relations at the heart of empire, reaching into every intimate abode. Social reproduction theory becomes a matter populated by a whole raft of surrogates, provisionists, test subjects, helps, and tech supports. Surrogate, more than reproductive or feminized, might be a word that proves useful for that field in bringing together the millions of precarious and or migrant workers laboring today as cleaners, nannies, butlers, assistants, cooks, and sexual assistants in first world homes, whose service is figured as dirty by commerce in contrast to the supposedly free or natural acts of an angelic white bourgeois family it in fact makes possible. Surrogacy in its current connotation is the lie and the truth of the situation. It speaks of the millions of living bodies secretly crouching inside automatons and behind the customer service machine interfaces of what Kalindi Bora has called, quote, surrogate humanity. Lewis argues that commercial surrogacy thus provides the impetus to rupture social relations surrounding human reproduction challenging gender and sexuality norms, and dismantling the family as a revolutionary project. Full surrogacy then becomes a demand for a collectivized reimagining of how this labour might be organised and distributed. So Lewis states, and I quote, "For if babies were universally thought of as anybody and everybody's responsibility, belonging to nobody, surrogacy would generate no products. Would it even be surrogacy at this point? Wouldn't the question then simply be, how can baby making best be distributed and made to realise collective needs and desires? Formal gestational workers' self-interest, like that of their unpaid counterparts, is an anti-work matter. And anti-work in the domain of care production is admittedly sometimes bloody. Their tacit threat to reproductive capitalism, whose knowledges and machinery they embody, takes the world a few steps closer towards queer polymaternalism," end quote. In forwarding these admittedly radical and revolutionary reproductive futures, and their relationship to current left-wing demands, Lewis leaves dramatically unattended the gestational labour of animals. This means that the ruthless incorporation of animal reproductive processes within capitalism, where a significant proportion of the world's food supply relies on the forced gestational labour of billions of animals, is not explored as a facet of analysis. This feels like a missed opportunity, as industrial animal agriculture raises some curious questions for how we might see the work of collective surrogacy. Forced gestational labour is, after all, the story of human domestication of animals. This labour intensifies and assumes industrial proportions under capitalism and explicitly becomes a process of value production. Inclusion of animals in how we understand the interaction of capitalism and gestational labour is useful, as it allows us to see the different ways in which regimes of biopolitical control and property rights play out around gestation. Not only noting, as Lewis does, that the politics of gestational labour shifts when we look outside of the boundaries of the white heterosexual family, ranging from histories of racialized slavery and the dislocation of Black families to the politics of trans parenting, but also noticing the way in which, unfortunately, a technically mediated, industrial-scale forced gestational labour becomes norm where we move outside of the bounds of the human. Capitalist animal agriculture represents something that might be described as a case of absolute, to quote Cressida Lemon, quote, "enforcement and control of the means of reproduction," end quote. Secondly, and related to the above point, animals dominated by the social relation of capital already experience, quote, "full surrogacy now," since under industrial animal agriculture, there are no property connections that bind an animal who performs gestational labour to their progeny. Indeed, central to the reality of these animals is the continual loss of this connection, property in oneself, property in one's kin. Animal agriculture thus provides a compelling account of total surrogacy as a key pillar of capital's domination of life. Total control over the reproductive lives of animals is a central structuring force in these human-animal relations. This surrogacy is, of course, not what Lewis has in mind in the political demand for full surrogacy now, which is for Lewis a radical demand for collectivizing the labour of gestation and care, and dismantling the patriarchal heteronormative family as its structural function under capitalism. However, the full surrogacy now experienced by animals is instructive in a different way. The surrogacy fully mediated by industrial capitalism, which is experienced by animals, presents an extreme and negative scenario for the abolition of the family, and perhaps offers us a glimpse and one nightmarish vision of the most extreme imagining of the fully subsumed capitalist family, different from the contemporary vision offered by neoliberal capitalism to most humans. Here, I don't at all mean to imply that Lewis's proposals for the abolition of the family and collectivized responsibility for reproductive work are a problem. On the contrary, their implications, if they are applied to animals under capitalism, would be significant. Importantly, in my view, they provide a different avenue for political focus and action by animal advocates. Here, and in ending my paper, there are two political demands that are worth considering. The first is the feminist demand for those who do gestational labour to refuse this work. The second demand is that gestational labour and care work, which is otherwise integral to the family, be dispersed and collectivised, thus putting into effect full surrogacy now as the democratisation of this labour. These two demands, of course, have dramatic implications if they are applied to animals, and I think offer different and useful political pathways for animal advocates. First, the right to refuse gestational labour has profound implications for contemporary utilisations of animals. This is because the right to control over reproduction offers a different focal point for thinking about the means of production under capitalism. Forged within the language of analytic philosophy and liberal political theory, much contemporary animal rights theory is centred around classic, quote, negative rights, such as freedom from detention and torture, or rights to legal personhood. This traditional focus has in some ways shaped the strategies of animal advocates. Much animal advocacy today focuses energy within the production chains of animal agriculture on the trauma of mass confinement, the transport of animals, the act of killing, and of course, consumption. However, this campaigning often underemphasizes a central element that supports the whole structure of animal agriculture, namely the gestational work of animals to reproduce the raw materials and products within this vast value chain. Here, the reproductive rights of animals is surely a unique tactical goal for advocates. Quite simply, if animals had the right to refuse this gestational labour, then this would be the end of animal agriculture. This is because the reproductive work of animals in creating new animals within animal agriculture materializes the labour force and the eventual consumption commodities that would flow from this. From this standpoint, this gestational labour provided is crucial for the whole capitalist system of industrial animal agriculture, and with this, the positioning within capitalism of animals as a means of subsistence. Much work within feminist animal studies has, of course, highlighted this centrality of this reproductive labour, and in a sense, I'm not claiming to offer something new. However, I think Lewis's call for the refusal of gestational labour provides an opportunity to reframe this work within the context of the unique reproductive work performed by animals within our economies. It also allows us to tactically focus our energies on different elements within animal agriculture. For example, the distinct layer of the human labour force within animal agriculture that is involved in facilitating and forcing reproductive work. The second demand for the collectivisation of gestational and care labour is more complex to imagine for animals. Because the labour of animals is positioned as a means of subsistence for human populations, this labour cannot easily be shared and not in a reciprocal way. And perhaps this can only be meaningfully shared if humans themselves are willing to be available to be the means of subsistence for animal populations, which of course, in some ways is absurd. But I think there is a different, more radical demand here around arranging labour time and energies in a way that enables the flourishing of both humans and non-humans. This demand is, after all, about challenging the necessity of all labour, including gestational work. At least for me, this involves challenging the idea that animals should be put to work for us in order to achieve our own liberation and pleasures. Instead, we should be asking how societies might be built on shared visions for flourishing and pleasure for humans and non-humans. If animals and humans were together collectively responsible for reproductive futures, then this would be a very different form of production, a very different form of economy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dinesh. Do I have to unpin you?
I'm going to stop share.
Okay. There's so much to think about there already, but I'm going to just ask Katie to just begin immediately, if that's okay, and we can have a discussion after.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank
Thank you so much, Miriam, for the invitation to join this event. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you all for coming at whatever hour your time zone delivers you here in. And thank you, Dinesh, for this really awesome paper. As I said, I read it a number of times over the last week or so, and it really sent my mind in so many different directions. I've tried to capture a few of these thoughts for today in a coherent way. I'm a field researcher and storyteller, and so I thought I'd think with you, Dinesh, and with all of you joining today through the lens of a couple of stories from my time in the field. The first story I want to tell is one about cows raised in cow-calf operations in north central Washington state in the US. I moved from the intensely urban geographic context of Seattle 2 years ago to an incredibly remote town near the Canadian border in north central Washington. It's a town of about 100 year-round residents, populated in large part by beef ranchers. By global and US standards, these are relatively small-scale operations that would fall under the category of free-range beef. Ranchers raise a couple hundred cows on average, some exceeding this number significantly and some raising only a couple dozen cows. Even in these small-scale production spaces, cows are artificially inseminated, enrolling the gestational labor of cows in the case of pregnancy, birthing calves, and caring for them. But bulls, too, are co-opted for the reproductive labor of semen production. Whereas in many large-scale operations, bulls are typically absent from the agricultural landscape, replaced by frozen semen doses shipped through the global industry of large-scale semen production farms. Here, they're often kept in pens adjacent to where cows and their calves are living, present on the landscape, but severed from the familial and kinship communities. Cow-calf operations differ in a key way from other forms of gestational labor in the food system. Calves remain with their mothers for about 2 years. During this time, social bonds are cemented in those mother-calf relationships and in the broader kinship relations of being part of a larger herd. In my past research on dairy production, it was the overwhelming norm to remove calves from their mothers within hours or a day or two after birth. This immediate alienation was done primarily so that milk and even colostrum produced immediately after birth can be funneled directly into commodity exchange, thus maximizing even down to the day how much milk each cow can produce for profit generation. But in cow-calf ranching, where calves remain with their mothers for a couple of years, the gestational labor of the care of the calf is assigned to the cow herself and to the rest of the herd. The human labor and economic costs of feeding and caring for calves is saved by maintaining the cow as laborer and carer. In this sense, the gestational labor is intensified. The cow is, like other cows in the food industry, impregnated each year, but is also tasked with maintaining the life and health of the next generations of raw materials and consumption commodities. The form of ranching practiced here is considered free-range production of beef. Cows are impregnated on ranches at the end of summer or early fall and give birth on ranches in the late spring and early summer. After the cows give birth and the new calves have been castrated, branded, and ear tagged for easy identification, they're transported up into the hills and dumped either on state forest or other public land leased for pennies to ranchers, or on private land also leased on the cheap to ranchers for grazing. Here they spend the summer grazing on pasture or foraging in state forests, loose for the most part beyond being contained by cattle guards on the roads. With so much space, there's a low density of cows who are visible at any given time. In the late summer or early fall, before the snow flies for winter, the cows and their calves are rounded up, usually by cowboys on horseback, loaded into transport trailers, and moved either back to the ranches for winter or to feedlots where they're crowded in, their lives and bodies oriented to the metabolic labor of fattening for slaughter, in the case of steers, or for the gestational labor of a winter of pregnancy for the cows. From there, they're either transported to a large slaughterhouse hours away, or they're moved back up the hill for another summer of grazing and foraging. When I first saw cows in the woods here, I struggled with what I was seeing. In the forest, cows are relatively free to live in community with their kin, and they're free for a few months each year from direct contact or intervention by humans. This seemed like a good life, I thought. But it was the ear tags, the brands, and the transport trailers' movement up and down the hill that punctuated the seasons, that acted as the specter of their life's orientation around Dinesh's 3 forms of farmed animal life: the consumable commodity, raw material, and labor. Gestational labor was unfolding in these woods in the cow caring for her calf or calves, and in the 3-month break she received to prepare her body for its next impregnation. Occasionally, ranchers dump a pregnant cow in the woods, and she gives birth outside of the confines of the ranch. Until a rancher notices a calf has been born, they have not been ear tagged, branded, or castrated. When I see these newborn calves free of the marks of property relations, it's a kind of glimmer of what a new generation of cows born momentarily outside the immediate control of the commodity circuit might mean or look like. But of course, these calves are always located at the end of the season, not at all free from the commodity forms by which their lives will be defined. The second story I want to share takes us to the so-called poultry auction yard in Washington state, about an hour from Seattle. These auctions sell all kinds of birds. Hundreds sell over the course of a few hours. Hens, roosters, chicks of various ages, ducks and ducklings, geese and goslings, quails and quail chicks, game hens, and curiously also rabbits. The poultry auction is unlike any other type of auction I've attended. In other auctions, the animals are viewable beforehand, confined in a series of pens behind the auction hall. You can wander the rows considering the purchase of an individual animal. At the poultry auction, though, there is no preview. The birds are contained in cardboard boxes until the moment of sale in the auction ring. The boxes are either folded or taped closed, and some of them the employees struggled to open, they were taped so tightly. With the ones that were folded closed, she would plunge one arm through the folded top, root around, and yank out a bird through the still folded lid. In many of the boxes, there were multiple birds, and so she would repeat this action until her hands were filled with either all the birds in the box or as many as she could hold, usually a limit of 3 or 4. For the boxes where she couldn't hold all the birds at once, she'd turn to the auctioneer to say that there were X number more in the box. The speed at the poultry auction is staggering, maintained by the violent handling of the birds to efficiently sell hundreds of them in a short time frame. The energies of gestational labor brought them to the auction, where they're transformed in an instant into a raw material of exchange, and following the auction into a consumable commodity or a gestational or metabolic laborer. Commodifying an animal like an egg-laying chicken, conscripted into the gestational labor of egg or meat production, is an abstracting process. The chicken's inner life, subjectivity, emotional connections, and kinship ties are obscured in the way she circulates as capital, generated from being instrumentalized for what she can produce. This is the structural logic underwriting the auction yard, and it's connected to a multi-billion-dollar global trade in farmed animals, meat, dairy, and eggs. The scale at which the auction yard operates relies on local, relatively small-scale circulation of animal capital, but this local site of exchange is connected to these global networks of trade, both materially and conceptually. Resisting this abstraction involves remembering that, as David Wolfson says, these hundreds and globally billions are one and one and one. As box after box of chickens passed through the ring, it was difficult to individuate the birds, and the process itself had a kind of numbing effect. For instance, a nectarine box came along, packed with who the auctioneer described as ISA brown or Lohmann brown classic hens. The employee pulled out 3 large brown hens and held them up by the wings, turning to make sure all audience members could see who was for sale. She turned to the auctioneer and said something I couldn't make out, and the auctioneer immediately called out, "Okay, we've got 2 more of the same in this box, so 5 layers total, all the same. Let's start the bidding at $8, so 5 times the money. That's $8 each, 5 times the money, all to one. Buyer takes all 5. After the bidding, the birds sell for $11 each to a buyer seated above me in the bleachers, a total of $55. And then the hens are stuffed back in the box and taken out of the ring to be reshelved. The next box was also a nectarine box containing 5 more brown hens, clearly from the same seller. "Okay, we've got 5 more of the same price, same weight. Can I get $11 each? Remember, that's 5 times the money." The buyer who had lost the previous bid took these hens, also at $55 for the box of 5. A third nectarine box appeared, and a fourth, and then a fifth, all with 5 brown hens in each. More of the same, the auctioneer would say, the boredom and impatience creeping into his voice as he rushed each sale a little more than the last. I thought about this more of the same and the function it serves. It meant in this context all the same breed, sex, look, and condition. It sped up the auction process. But I thought about how this more of the same obscured the way that each of these birds was a unique individual, not at all the same. Each of them would have had a distinct personality, likes and dislikes, would have interacted with their kin and community in their own way, and would be experiencing their lives as sensitive beings with their own inner worlds, emotions, and relationships. But this more of the same was an important part of the abstracting logic of commodification, a refusal to acknowledge the subjectivity of these individual beings or the effects of their objectification. The flow of birds in boxes is periodically interrupted by the sale of eggs, another product of gestational and metabolic labor. farm fresh eggs from chickens, ducks, geese, and quails at much lower prices than are available anywhere else. And also there were many dozens of fertilized eggs, including a set of 4 peacock eggs at one auction I attended. These eggs were sold to those buyers who wanted to incubate and hatch birds on their own at home. It's a kind of commodification oriented around futurity, as the gestational labor of farmed animals often is. But in this case, it's the promise of new life, not the new life itself, that can be commodified and consumed, and which requires care to manifest. Without adequate care, the precarious value of these eggs would be lost. This care takes a form of surrogacy in its most basic sense. The gestational labor needed to bring an egg to the point of hatching is shifted to the humans who buy the eggs. The bird from whom these eggs came is absent, her gestational labor ending prior to the birth of her chicks, paused until her next eggs appear to be hatched and raised by the hen herself, or when her fertilized eggs are themselves commodified, or in the case of non-fertilized eggs, when the egg she lays daily is taken from her and transformed into a consumption commodity. I'm a geographer by training, and so I spend a lot of time thinking about scale. In both the case of the birds I encountered and the cows, bulls, and their calves in ranching in the area where I live, production starts at a small scale. In fact, it begins at the smallest scale, the scale closest in, of the individual animal body in the forced reproduction process and its subsumption of an animal's life and their reproductive autonomy, of which there is none in commercial animal food production, as Dinesh has explained. And actually, we might say that the accumulation of capital appropriates animal life at an even smaller scale than the individual, at the scale of the commodification of sperm through its circulation as its own commodity, the egg ready to be fertilized in the body of the cow, and the embryo that will grow into a new productive and reproductive commodity life. Beginning at this intimate scale, the animal's life is moved ever in the direction of larger scale production and consumption. The single cow becomes a cow and a calf. The cow and calf becomes part of a herd. The herd becomes a selection of different commodity forms. The continued reproductive labor in the cow, as she is forcibly inseminated to produce the next generation. The female calves move into the reproductive labor flow. The male calves are castrated, purposely severing their reproductive capacity, converting their energies to metabolic labor, and catalyzing their delineation as future meat. They move into the productive flow of raw materials and eventually into consumption commodities. As Dinesh explained, the reproductive labor of cows, excuse me, and I'd also add bulls, declines. They too become raw material and ultimately consumption commodities. Consumption in a form of, for example, low quality meat for the industrial fast food industry, or consumption in a different form as rendered flesh transformed into a set of new raw materials, bone meal, tallow, gelatin, so many other materials that will become consumption commodities like fertilizer, soap, pharmaceuticals, Jello. The list is really endless. Nearly every part of the animal's life and body generates value in these different forms of commodification and gestational and metabolic labor. These flows are spatial. Cows move from the ranch where reproduction is performed to the fields and forests where they graze, to feedlots where they're met with cows from different locales, and eventually to the industrial slaughterhouse where they join the flow of 85 billion animals slaughtered on land each year. From there, their value as consumption commodities is solidified in these more industrial forms of exchange. Birds flow into the auction yard from dozens of farmers, mostly bringing a small number of birds to sell, but they quickly become part of a mass in the density of volumes of birds that flow through the auction yard, replicating this global flow of commodified animals for food. At the heart of these shifting scales and the flows of animals through the commodity circuit is the social reproduction of animal agriculture. Dinesh asks us to consider how structural relations necessitate social reproduction on the part of humans in the form of producers reproducing the industry itself through appropriating and directing the reproductive labor of animals, through the social and cultural norms that must be reproduced to generate the interest, knowledge, and commitment to animal agriculture across generations of producers, and through the social reproduction on the part of consumers as the consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs is solidified with every meal consumed as a normalized practice of human consumption and subsistence. In ranching, social reproduction unfolds in the cross-generational practices of raising animals for food, and in particular in the social reproduction of masculinity that's tied to farming and ranching in particular, a landscape where boys become real men and real men become ranchers and cowboys. There's a 9-year-old boy I know who lives here in the community. I'll call him Billy. He's incredibly sensitive to animals and to the natural world around him. And this is something we've bonded about a lot of times, sort of noticing the kind of natural world around us and talking about all the little sort of nuances and points of interest. But the father of his best friend is part of the ranching community. Each spring, ranchers and ranch hands gather to castrate and brand new calves. These gatherings become parties, the adult men drinking and joking and laughing to lighten the mood, distracting from the violence they're performing on these new calves without anesthetic. When Billy turned 8, he was invited to participate in this annual ritual. When he got back from the castration and branding event, he was shaken. I asked him how it made him feel. His eyes welled up with tears, and he said, "Sad. They're just babies, and they were crying." I said, "It is sad. I'm sorry." But then he said, "It was kind of fun too. I was playing with the other kids. Oh, and Dave," his friend's father, said, "This will make us men." This social reproduction, in addition to delivering violence on the calves, also enacts a kind of violence on the boys who participate, the violence of masculinity that crushes or buries the sensitivity they might feel toward animals, and the eventual violence these boys turned men will deliver on future generations of animals if they choose to continue in the ranching tradition of their families. In the auction yard, social reproduction happens in a slightly different way. Yes, there's a cross-generational practices of farming that get reproduced through the endless exchange of animals as consumption commodities, raw materials, and laborers. The auction is, after all, a space for the economic exchange, and thus a kind of solidification of these relations to animals. But there's also the social reproduction of community itself. The sociality unfolding in the auction yard cements the connection of rural communities organized around agricultural production. This social reproduction cannot be divorced from forms of formal production. On one hand, it is the formal production practices that necessitate dynamics of social reproduction. Without it, as Dinesh argues, there would be an end to animal agriculture. Consumption of animal products is driven by the dominance of animal consumption, both materially in the eating of animals and conceptually in the framing of animals as food in the first place. As a way to conclude, I want to think with Dinesh and with you about the call he makes for turning on its head the social, economic, and political relations that trap animals in the category of food at the most fundamental core. I've been thinking a lot lately about the concept of flourishing, especially for farmed animals whose lives unfold so far from the possibility of flourishing that it's hard to even imagine what that would look like. When humans have so overwhelmingly been the source of harm and control, what role can we play that frees not only animals, but us too from the confines and constrictions of this kind of relationship? The closest place I can think of where this kind of work is unfolding is the farmed animal sanctuary, a space that challenges not the domestication of farmed animal species, but instead their commodification and production value. In many of these spaces, the focus is on transforming both the material and conceptual lives of formerly farmed animals, in essence, working to decommodify them. Removed from the commodity circuit, human caregivers work to shape lives for individual animals that are oriented around their flourishing, living their lives on their own terms within the constraints of captivity and limited resources sanctuaries may have to care for them. Many of the sanctuaries I visited in my research do beautiful work to help animals recuperate themselves, who they are after productive labor, how they want to live, and how their lives can be fulfilling and meaningful, individual to individual. And yet sanctuaries are still captive spaces, a necessary boundary to keep animals safe as they are encircled in the geographic space and protective care of the sanctuary and its humans. Animals are limited in their movement and by the particularities of the spaces humans create for them. Veterinary care, type and availability of food, who they're housed with, these are all forms of human control over animals at sanctuaries. The best sanctuaries I've seen, though, let animals lead humans in a kind of co-creation of space that challenges human ideas about how animals want to live and allow for greater self-determination. In thinking about Dinesh's call for a reproductive rights approach to animal advocacy, the work of sanctuaries faces a quandary. Whereas animals' reproductive lives and labor are co-opted and intensified to increase production in the food industry, most sanctuaries also engage in extreme intervention in this realm. Reproduction is curtailed in sanctuary spaces, usually for the practical reason that there are so many animals globally who need care, and there are limited resources and space for this care to unfold. A reproductive rights approach to farmed animal liberation challenges the norm of reproductive control embraced at many sanctuaries. This isn't to disparage the work of sanctuaries by any means. In my experience, the best sanctuaries are the closest thing to a life of flourishing for farmed animal species. It's in fact because of this kind of revolutionary care that sanctuaries might be a place to think about what reproductive rights could look like for animals and what reproductive freedom for individuals of these species might lead to at a larger societal scale. When I imagine flourishing for farmed animal species, there are certainly inherent constraints in how this reality can unfold. But this isn't a reason to not do the imaginative and practical work of trying to create alternative visions and lives for and with animals. In fact, I think these constraints can be opportunities to consider and try to solve the challenges this evolving project entails. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, for a really brilliant response to Dinesh. And Dinesh, I feel that I want to ask you whether you would like to respond to anything.
I know that we don't have, I mean, there's lots I want to say, and thank you, Kate, it was amazing. But I know that we don't have that much time left, so it'd be good. Maybe we should just open it up, and maybe in some of my responses, I could weave some thoughts as well into Katie's paper.
I will open the floor then to anybody who has a question, although at the moment we have nothing in the chat as far as I can tell. You might need to give people some time to absorb all of that. Would you like to start with a response, Dinesh, while people are gathering their thoughts together?
Sure. Katie, thank you so much for just such a generous and thoughtful response. There's so much to say and so much I want to hear more about. I suppose I just want just a final point. I don't know. I'll start by saying I don't know what the appropriate way to think about reproductive rights, or maybe the proposal I'm pushing, which, as I say in the paper, I don't think I'm doing anything different from what lots of feminist animal studies scholars have done. But I feel like when I look at the kind of mainstay tactics of animal rights, and you say some of the images around what is seen as the major harms of industrial animal agriculture, we often focus on sites of torture, on stunning. I mean, sorry, sites of slaughter, on stunning, on confinement, which again are the kind of classical rights violations, let's say. And it really has struck me that we don't problematize reproductive rights as the kind of foreground for the work we're doing. And I think it has a number of implications. I think, Katie, you're right that it's unsettling for some of the spaces that we might think of as spaces of liberation, such as sanctuaries. And that's because I would say that the foundation for domestication or regimes of animal domestication is control of reproduction. It's so naturalized that it's what we assume is going to follow in even spaces that are imagined as spaces of liberation. I'm not saying that sanctuaries don't think about this. I know that they do, and lots of us are thinking around these questions. They're difficult, but it is one challenge. But I do want to say that, again, I'm curious tactically about what does this mean? What does it mean to take seriously reproduction as a site of production and one that is a tactical goal? So let me give you one example. If people have read Alex Blanchette's Porkopolis, there's a 2 or 3 chapters which are just quite astounding and disturbing, where Alex talks about his field work in a kind of growing barn, and the direct involvement of workers are actually often quite gendered. So there's a lot of women in this large agricultural, industrial animal agriculture facility, hoggery facility in the Midwest United States. And it seemed to me that when I read these sections, I thought, well, wouldn't it be useful for us as advocates to separate out this labor force as different from the people who, say, are doing killing or stunning or something like that, that are actually involved in, let's say, care labor to reproduce the animal populations that are used in food systems? And what would it mean to actually target this labor force particularly, which are largely gendered, by the way? And I think the interesting thing about Alex's work is that he talks about the daily work by workers in those production lines to make animals survive against the aversive conditions around so that they can become food. So to me, there's something really interesting about this space. I'm also, in a connected way, very interested in vets and veterinarians and their role in animal agriculture. And again, to me, it suggests this sort of focus on reproductive rights suggests different sites where advocates can intervene than maybe the ones that we're using now. And that's part of my interest as well.
Thank you, Dinesh. And we actually have a question from a vet, Camille.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing me as a vet.
Not just a vet.
Yeah,
many things as well as a vet.
I feel a lot of pressure on my thank you very much for the different papers. I really enjoyed it. And again, there are a lot of things to disentangle here. I was quite interested in specifically your experience, Katie, with this young boy, you know, trying to navigate in these different emotions. And I also, during my field work, met children from farmers who would be very touched, resistant to their family's practice. And I started to try to unwrap a bit this with the family and the farmer. And I was wondering if you had conversation with this young boy surrounding, and if you encounter other you know, situations like this, if you could elaborate a bit on that, because I found that there is something changing here, and maybe some opportunities as well, if we think about you know, what would come next.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question. I think so. In some of my past research, I interviewed people who had done 4-H or Future Farmers of America, these kind of educational programs where kids raise an animal from sort of early after birth until they usually sell them at a state fair auction and in those, so I didn't talk to any people who are currently kids there, but in those contexts, there did seem to be a real change. Several of the people I talked to had moved to or were part of sort of rural areas that were closer into urban areas, and there was like this shifting kind of dynamic in terms of children just not wanting to go into farming, moving to urban areas, choosing to do different things, and the sort of like sort of ethos or norms around farming or itself and sort of what the relationships are with animals was sort of shifting. And I'm not sure, I mean, I'm just sort of speculating, but I think part of that might be sort of proximity to larger populations, urban areas, access to the internet, and sort of exposure to different ideas about farming that may influence kids. Here, though, it's odd because it's so remote, and the community, well, it's quite eclectic in its makeup, but overarchingly, there's this norm that like, kids go into farming. If they don't, they sort of like disappear over to the coast, which is what they call Western Washington up here, and just sort of leave the community. And so there's really this like surprising and something I haven't seen before, kind of cemented in way that this operates, and that there's just, it seems so difficult for kids to get out of that kind of, either having to leave or just kind of being conditioned, like socially conditioned into that. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't want to talk too long here, but it's just sort of some differences in what I'm seeing here versus in past research.
Thank you for sharing.
I think it's so interesting what you're saying about the social reproduction of the actual human communities that do this work. I think Sonia has a question that's kind of related to that now in the text.
There's a question from David around storytelling. I don't know, David, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so as actually an interesting thing on kind of what you just said there as well, as someone who grew up on a farm in rural Ireland, I have a thing where I became very disconnected from the farm afterwards. But my question was for Katie. You told a lot of stories throughout your talk. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the importance of storytelling in discussing farmed animals and the types of narratives we use when looking at farmed animal lives. In my own work, I look a lot at perspective and kind of the individual versus the collective and how those are depicted. But I'm just interested on your own kind of general thoughts on this topic in general.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and one I've been thinking a lot about lately in terms of the stories I'm writing up, and actually I'm working on trying to put together a novel, which would be a whole different kind of storytelling. But yeah, I love stories. I think people love stories. We live in stories. We create our own stories and narratives about ourselves, about our lives, relationships, really everything. And I think that, as you say, there's the storytelling allows a sort of focus and kind of zoomed in lens on the individual, which I think, is a powerful access point for people to think about and consider and relate to the lives of someone like a farmed animal who normally would be, sort of set apart and not sort of accessible in terms of their individuality, their sort of inner life, what they're experiencing in the industry. So I think that just the sort of storytelling as an anchor can then be that kind of window into like more collective, as you say, kind of awareness and sort of zooming out to the broader population. I think, Dinesh, did you have thoughts on sort of storytelling and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm not a very good storyteller, but I admire people who are. I think it's really important to, I mean, we're lucky in our field, in animal studies, that there's some really spectacular storytellers, including Katie, that give us an actual image of life for animals in contexts which they're obfuscated by the production system. So it's this opportunity to understand. So I think storytelling is important.
I hope it's okay to make an intervention here, which is, I think it's important to remember that scientists also tell stories. I think sometimes we get a kind of division of labor with the social sciences and humanities and arts on the one side doing this kind of rich work, and scientists on the other doing a different kind of work. And I think that disguises the extent to which scientists also are engaged in storytelling all the time. They're just a little bit more difficult to unpack those stories. They present themselves less clearly as stories. And if anyone knows my own work, you'll know that they are all the more dangerous for that. So I think kind of identifying the kind of techniques of storytelling in science and being aware of them and possibly critical of them is also something to think about. We've got two really great questions in the chat. So I'm going to Mathieu's. Would you like to read your question out about pro-animal activism, or shall I read it if you're here?
Yeah, thank you. I'll try. I'm in a fairly noisy place. There's basically my dog barking like crazy at the neighbors that he can see out the window.
We can't hear
Who
it.
is vegan, by the way, as well, which opens a lot of other ethical questions too, but that's not the point. Yes, my question is to Dinesh mostly, but I think to everyone, and it's a very practical question that actually comes from discussions that I've had with my students in a course that I taught on animal rights and non-human animal politics. The question basically is, in terms of actual real life pro-animal activism and campaigning, how could a call such as your call, Dinesh, for the right to refuse gestational labor work in practice? Isn't it the case that a call like this would just be flat out rejected out of hand, even by sympathetic policymakers or lawmakers, MPs, people like that, precisely because, as you said, this call spells the end of the animal industry? So is it possible to turn that kind of a call into an actual campaigning postulate? Thank you.
A great question. And the simple answer is, of course. Of course it's going to be flat out rejected. So, but the reason I think it's important to frame the question around reproductive rights, or the reason I want to frame it, is that when I look at the totality of global animal agriculture and fisheries, very clearly in a structural sense, forced reproduction regimes, metabolic labor and gestational labor prop up the whole structure. So if you were going to tactically attack a segment of the production chain, surely it would be this labor, or this site of production. That doesn't mean that going to the media and saying we want reproductive rights for animals is going to be successful. Of course it's not. And there are different challenges that this presents to us. One is, I guess, ideological or epistemic, which is how do we shift knowledge systems and awareness, which is one role for advocacy. The second is, who are we working with tactically to realize some of these goals? And as I mentioned, one thing that focus on this reproductive work or reproductive labor highlights is that actually, if you look at the totality of animal agriculture, there's a whole bunch of animals that are engaged in metabolic labor to become food, but there's a whole bunch of animals that have a distinct structural place in reproducing those animals who will become food. So to me, that's a segmentation of the labor force that's interesting to pay attention to, and it's worth us separating. The second is that there's a whole range of human workers engaged in that, in facilitating that reproductive work. that are doing very different tasks from, say, workers who are on the slaughter line. If we're going to make alliances, say with unions, which is something I've looked at in previous work, it would make sense to be thinking about, well, how do we could we tactically work with these workers in different ways? So again, I'm not presenting reproductive rights as a slogan that is going to win over policymakers. Of course it won't. It's offering a different framing for looking at the totality that's before us and maybe giving us different tactical sites of intervention.
Thank you.
Sue, I'm going to skip back and forth between the questions and the text.
Thanks, Miriam. Hi, Katie. Hi, Dinesh. It's lovely to see you both, and thank you for these this wonderful discussion of your work. I want to sort of go back to Katie's discussion of sanctuaries as these interesting and somewhat paradoxical spaces where, on the one hand, animals have, in some sense, been removed from the system that Dinesh has so richly described, and have, you know, many opportunities to actually become self-determining beings. At the same time, these are spaces where reproduction is typically quite drastically controlled. So when I have spoken with people in sanctuary spaces about this, it's usually explained as a necessary response to lack of space, lack of resources, and response to the emergency of you know, all the animals that they would not be able to take in, for example, if they allowed the animals already in sanctuary to reproduce and have have reproductive freedom. And so this to me raises a couple of things. One is, yes, this tension between responding to the catastrophe of animal agriculture, and on the other, prefiguring something future where maybe animals are flourishing, and that includes being self-determining about their reproductive lives and labor. So that's one, I guess, one question I have is just about how important you think these prefiguring moments are compared to the more responsive moments. And so should sanctuaries actually be trying to explore and understand what it would mean for animals to enjoy reproductive freedoms. But the other question it raises in my mind is that this idea of space, of there not being enough space, enough resources for animals to have this kind of self-determining life. Meanwhile, humans are occupying more and more space and resources of the world. You know, we don't have serious conversations about limiting our own reproduction to make space for animals to have certain kind of self-determining liberty. And so I'm just, I guess my question is in relation to thinking about forced reproduction and something like reproductive freedom, like just whether either of you has thoughts about the importance of linking a conversation here with human freedoms in this realm, and or whether that's a bad idea. Just any thoughts that you might have about that would be, yeah, welcome. Thanks.
I can throw something in here. Yeah, no, Sue, I totally agree. And I was thinking as you were talking just about what you said about the sort of like prefiguring of a, you know, particular kind of model. And I think that for me, I'm like not an imaginative person particularly. Like I can communicate what I'm sort of seeing and observing, but to like dream up something like radically different is I find really difficult. And so I think that like I think the sort of sanctuary concept and practice is like a model of something that can then be sort of like worked with. It's there, you know, as a sort of imperfect but evolving project, and I think that just like sort of having something tangible to work with and on and from is really useful. It's just so I just want to make that note. But the other thing I was thinking about in terms of the sort of linking kind of animals' reproductive freedom and self-determination to you know, human struggles or movements around reproductive freedom. The US is just such an interesting example right now with the overturning of, you know, Roe v. Wade and the sort of onslaught on reproductive rights for you know, for women and people with uteruses in the US. And so I was thinking when I was, you know, reading your paper, Dinesh, about what would that look like in terms, like, is it a moment when reproductive rights are sort of so foregrounded in the public kind of discourse and sort of field of concern that it's a moment to link animals to that? Or is it because of the sort of like crisis and urgency around human reproductive rights in the US, like, is it one of those moments where people might be particularly resistant to that idea because they're like, look, humans are, you know, human reproductive rights are at stake here. We can't, you know, worry about animals at this stage, which I think comes up a lot in terms of the sort of social justice, like urgency and whether and how animals can get incorporated into those struggles. But yeah, it just was on my mind too about the kind of what's been going on over the last handful of years in the US in terms of the rollback of many reproductive rights for humans. But Dinesh, yeah, what do you think?
Super hard questions. Nice to see you, Sue. Look, I mean, one thing that I found really appealing about the analysis from Sophie Lewis was the provocation, which was, what does a world without forced gestational labor look like? And Lewis also highlights that force doesn't mean just somebody, you know, visibly forcing somebody to engage in labor. It's also about culture and norms that push this requirement as if it is natural onto bodies. I found this really interesting to think about in relation to animals, because this is, as I said, the foundation of our relations with animals. But it also, the focus on just forced gestational labor also helps to disentangle what we're talking about when we talk about reproductive rights. So one thing, and it's something I think you and Will have noted in your work, that the sanctuary space doesn't force gestational labor, right? There might be reproductive controls, but there isn't forced gestational labor. So it's one difference between the sanctuary and industrial animal agriculture, and I think that's an important difference. The second that I think is interesting about some of this sort of, I guess, Sophie Lewis, but other left thinking about reproductive labor and collectivization is removing reproduction as, not imagining reproduction as a private familial affair, but as something that is central to society and to the kind of deliberation we make about the kind of societies we live in. And to me, there's something really promising. It's complex, but something promising about thinking about this beyond the human, to be thinking about, well, to what extent are we in our communities, whether they're human communities or multi-species communities, are our reproductive practices and cultures, how do they relate to nature generally? I'm hesitant around questions around reproductive rights and human population size. And that's just because I'm very sensitive to the problem of global wealth distribution and the problems with some of the simplistic formulas that have been produced around human reproduction, because I don't think they take into account that problem of wealth distribution and who is actually contributing to the planetary destruction. That said, I think it's unreasonable. I think it's an interesting provocation from Sophie Lewis and others to say, actually, the means of production is actually the reproduction, and maybe it's useful for us to collectively think about reproduction when we're thinking about what a society is and what a society means to flourish. So to me, that's something interesting about that. I don't have solid answers, but I think it's in line with what you're suggesting. I think there's something interesting about opening these questions beyond the human, but also thinking about, well, what does it mean for humans as well?
Thank you both.
Can I, Jessica, you had your hand up, but you don't anymore. I just want to check that you don't have a question. We've got a couple in the chat, which I'd like to, if we can get them in. Dinesh,
Yeah, I'm
very
happy to
conscious
go ahead
of the
with the
time
chat.
for you. Yeah. Are you sure?
Go ahead with the chat. Yeah,
Are
yeah,
you sure?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Sonia can't see this one because it's written directly to me. Is there Yathu here, who asked a question
Yes.
about hi.
Hi.
Do you-
Yeah, I'm happy for you to. I'll read
Shall I?
it.
Do you
Yeah.
want? Okay.
I don't mind. I'm just. I actually, can you read it? Because
Yeah, sure. No, I can read it.
I can't find it. Yeah.
Yeah. This is the one that Sonia can't see. So my question to the speaker is whether they had thought about reproduction in relation to indigenous animal hunters, trappers. How do they think about reproduction? Are there any sources for reimagination from that rich literature? They might also have spoken about this already. Apologies if they have. I joined halfway through. So it's a question about reproduction in relation to indigenous animal hunters and trappers.
Thanks for the question. It's not a focus of my work, but one thing I'd say is that this is one difference between subsistence food systems and the capitalist food system. In my view, capitalist animal agriculture fundamentally and quite ominously subsumes gestational labor and reproductive labor as value producing in a way that isn't replicated by subsistence food systems or hunting or something like that. So to me, there's that, and that's why the focus of the book and my work has been on industrial animal agriculture under capitalism, because I take the view that this is quite different from subsistence-based food systems that might exist in the world now or have existed previously. And that's because the aim of the subsumption of reproduction and gestational labor is production of profit, not necessarily just subsistence. So that hopefully that clarifies, but I have thought a little bit about that's not the focus of my work.
We've got a final question in the chat from Yamini. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you so much. Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Dinesh. That was one of the most absorbing conversations that, and I took in every moment. I could have heard another hour of your conversation. Thank you so much to both. I was just thinking about, I was just thinking about these sorts of, how these logics reapply to India, where it's not just capitalism, but nationalism and statism that are such a driving force behind the cow's reproductive labor, right? The reproduction of the cow is almost seen as the reinforcement of the aspirational Hindu state in India currently, especially under the current government regime. So I was just wondering about how these and I think India presents a particularly iconic case where nationalism and identity is so intertwined with dairy production, but I don't think it's unique. It's just exceptionally strong here. So I was just wondering about how we are not just talking about moving the body out of capitalism, but also out of nationalism, and parsing these two strands out becomes so difficult. And I know, Dinesh, that you're also working on animals and the state at the moment. So I was just wondering, I just wanted to sort of get a sense of both your thoughts about this, if we have enough time.
Katie, do you have something on this? So I've got some thoughts, but do you want to go first, or do you?
I could just throw in one thing, which is I think that just this particular context I'm in here, there's it's a very strong Trump community, and a lot of the, I mean, I think this, Yamini, you and I have talked about this in other kind of cross analyses with India and the US in the state, but just being here in this local place, there's this sense of like, one, ranching as a sort of like what it means to be American. It's sort of this like heartland, this like iconic figure of the cowboy as sort of looming like larger than life as a kind of symbol of the, American nation state. And then also just like, so there's, and then the consumption of meat as being like this kind of American, sort of defining what that means. And then Trump has just become so sort of larger than life here. And people, and we're in the middle of hunting season. It started a couple of weeks ago. And so there's all these men roaring around in pickups with Trump bumper stickers, shooting elk and deer and grouse and other critters. And a lot of that is this kind of narrative about like sort of ownership of the land, of like this entitlement to space that's rooted in sort of what it means to be American. The little store in town has a sign out that says God, guns, and country, or no, sorry, God, guns, and Trump. So there's just, I don't know, I think there's like this Trump thing, but also the kind of tied to ranching, to hunting, to sort of entitlement to space in the kind of creation and cementing of the state.
Maybe I can just throw in that there's a section in the book and in Animals Capital where I talk about the existence of animals as not only as raw material and a commodity, but also in the symbolic realm as a currency. And in my view, that's also something we're managing or dealing with, is that animals appear as a way to cement and uphold human supremacy. This is sort of my language, and this is cultural, so it happens in different contexts. And Yamini, as you know, in India, it happens in a very different way from other parts of the world, that animals stand in as a kind of symbolic currency, and they do different work in that respect. So that's also something as advocates we need to unpick in different contexts. So thanks for the question. That's a good one.
I think it's a great place to end as well on Trump, given next week, and the links between nation state and capitalism and animals. I want to say thank you so much to everybody for coming again, and especially, obviously, to Dinesh and Katie for such really rich, amazing questions. And this will be so much that I think it's a lot to absorb in one session, in one moment. So happily, this is going to be recorded, and if anyone wants to watch it again or recommend it to anybody, they should go to the UCL Anthropocene website. Dinesh, especially, I'm hugely conscious of the time for you. I think nearly midnight now. So I'm going to call it a day there and just say thank you again to everybody, and hope to see you at the next session, which is on the 11th of December. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.